Hi guys! One of the most common questions that I get about my landscape astrophotography is what is stacking and why is it an important tool for landscape astrophotography? So I decided to make a video tutorial today to walk you through some of the basic steps that are involved in stacking multiple images for noise reduction. And I'll show you a basic editing workflow to produce a final image using the stacked images that you use. So I'll walk you through a few things, but before we get started, if you want to follow along with this video and use your own images to process, you'll need a few things before we sit down to start. First of all, you'll need a set of images that were taken on the same night in the exact same tripod location using all of the exact same camera settings. So you have to have used the same ISO, you have to have used the same f-stop, the same focal distance if you have a zoom lens that has a focal distance that can be changed, and you have to have taken them from the exact same location with no camera movement between the frames at all. Once you've got 20 or 30 images from the same location at night of the night sky, then you're ready to sit down and you're ready to process them to stack. So you'll also need some basic image editing software. Today I'll be using Lightroom and Photoshop. You'll also need stacking software. If you're a PC user, this will be Sequator. If you're a Mac user, you can download Starry Landscape Stacker. Now, Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom are not free. They cost around $10 a month for users to access. Sequator is a free download. If you're a PC user, you can download Sequator for free. I'll include the link in the description. And Starry Landscape Stacker is $39.99 right now in the Mac App Store. But you can download these softwares. I'll also use some Photoshop actions that I purchased from photographingspace.com. These are the Easy Noise Reduction, the Clara Sky, and the Mini Stars Photoshop actions that are all part of a pack that's on sale right now for $29.99. And now I don't get paid to advertise for these providers, but this is just the software that I use for my best results for landscape astrophotography. So let's go ahead and dig in. The way that we're going to run this video is first I'm going to give you an overview of what stacking is and how you can use it to improve your landscape astrophotography. Then I'll show you the basic edits that you should put into your image files before you translate them into an intermediate file format that Starry Landscape Stacker or Sequator can use. Then I'll show you the basic points about using Starry Landscape Stacker or Sequator to stack your images, and then I'll show you a basic editing workflow in Photoshop to add final edits to the image before it's ready to print or to share. So I've got my 36 images here ready to process and stack. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to load them into Lightroom. I've got 36 images, including one that has much brighter light in the foreground. So I had my Lume Cube and I used it to light the foreground in this last shot, so I had a shot to blend in to bring out more detail in those trees. But for now I'm just going to process it as if it's just like the rest of these files. So let me pop open one of these image files, and we'll go to Develop module within Lightroom. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the automatic settings that Lightroom applies when it imports a new file. So this will be the sharpening and the color noise reduction that it automatically applies. The other things that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to boost this. I'm watching this histogram here during all of the edits to make sure that I don't blow out my highlights or lose any detail on the image. So if the peak goes off the histogram here, you know that you're losing some of your highlight detail. If it goes too far to the right here, you know that you're really losing a lot of detail in the highlights. So what you want to do is you want to adjust this so that we've got a histogram peak that's roughly on the 1/3 mark as you move from the left to the right side of the histogram. So I'm going to bring that exposure up a little bit. I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit as well, just to see what I'm working with here. So I don't have great shadow detail in this image, so I'm glad that I had that last one to brush in with the extra light in it. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a close look at this area of the Milky Way. So you see the dark horse, you see these two bright spots, it's the Trifid and the Lagoon Nebulas over here. So they serve as a great point to show what type of highlight detail I'm able to preserve in an image. So I actually want to bring the highlights slider down some, and you see I can really start to see some of the shape of that nebula, the Lagoon Nebula here. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the whites up a little bit. Now I don't want to go too far because then I'm losing some of that shape detail that I'm trying to preserve here. But if I do bring a little bit of whites, if I bring the white slider up a little bit, I'm able to get a little bit more punch out of these light points in the sky. So now that I've got those taken care of, I'm going to take a look at the tone curve. I'm going to bring the highlights up a little bit, and I'm going to bring these mid-lights down just a little bit. Again, paying particular attention both to the histogram and to these nebula as a detail shot for me. So I can bring that down a little bit to bring some of that out, and that will help bring out some of the light in the image as well. The last thing I'm going to do before I do the final touch up here is I'm going to crank these color sliders up so I can really get a feel for the color in the image, and you can see we have too much green in the sky here. It makes the oranges of the light pollution and in the Milky Way look kind of pukey, and it just doesn't look very good. So I'm going to warm this up just a little bit to make those oranges and those yellows a little bit truer. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this tint slider up some so that we have more purples in the image than we have greens. So that's the extreme example, but I'm going to stick with about 12. I think that looks about right. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make some noise adjustments to the image. I don't want to move these sliders up above about 10, but you see even at 10, it produces a huge difference in what this image will actually look like. So I'm going to leave those just like that, and I'm going to bring my basic color sliders back down a little bit so that the image is more normal, and I think that looks about right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C on a Mac or on a PC, and I'm going to copy these settings. I'm going to go back into the group of pictures. I'm going to select all of them, and I'm going to Command or Control-Shift-V to paste the settings across the entire selection of images that I have here. Now once Lightroom has pasted these settings, the final step here is to export the files into a format that can be read by the stacking software. Now I recommend that you use a TIFF file format. This will retain as much detail as possible because you can use a format that has no compression applied to it. You can also maintain the color depth that you have out of the camera as well as the color space that you have out of the camera without losing any data. So we'll put these in the same place as the original files. We'll put them in a subfolder so that they're easy to find. We'll also make sure that the output sharpening is off and that you're not adding any watermarks to your image. With all of those settings selected, we're going to go ahead and click Export. I've already done this once before this tutorial, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to overwrite these images, and then Lightroom is going to go about its work. Okay, so just like that, we're done with Lightroom. And now what we're going to do is we're going to open up these files that we've just made inside Starry Landscape Stacker or Sequator. And now Sequator will use a slightly different workflow than Starry Landscape Stacker, but what we're going to do in post-processing in Photoshop will be largely the same. So even if you're using Sequator, just follow the steps for that program and use what we do in the last steps here. So I'm going to open up my files. It's going to read all of these images, and the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to ask me to make sure that it's identifying the images as the right image type. So what I have is all light images. In other words, I stood there and I took pictures of the night sky with the lens cap off to produce these images, regular exposures. So dark frames are taken at the same time with the same settings and under the same temperature conditions as your original light photos. So using dark frames, you take the same pictures but you put the lens cap on. So that the camera is just recording the noise that the image sensor is producing on its own. Using those images can help your stacking software produce better images, but today, for this tutorial, I'm only using light frames, which is also just fine. So it's correctly identified all of them as light frames, so I'm going to go ahead and click continue. It's going to load the frames into a composite image. So you see here the stars trailing across. We know it's a composite image, and I know my camera was really still because the foreground is still really stable. It's all in the same place across even this composite image. So Starry Landscape Stacker is going to load with a bunch of red dots. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these red dots cover just parts of the sky. So I'm going to pay particular attention to outline the horizon between the sky and the ground. And if I go over like that, I can hit Command Z, and that will eliminate the last brush stroke of dots that I added to the image. So I'm going to go through it. I'm just going to roughly color in some dots in the sky. I see that it put some dots on the ground as well, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to click Erase. I'm going to use the Erase brush to erase the dots that it added to the foreground here. And once I've done a pretty rough job of this to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and click Find Sky, and the program is going to automatically create a mask that I'm then going to go in and refine. So I'll paint in the sky now and make sure that all of the sky is painted in. Where I have areas that are along the horizon line here, I can use Command plus and Command minus to zoom in and out and to refine this mask a little bit. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, but this will help the software to produce a really nice crisp image if it has a good definition of where the sky is and where the ground is. So I'm going to just go through and I'm going to generally click on the large blocks and make my brush a little bit smaller so I can get into some of these detail areas here. But again, this really does not need to be perfect in order for the software to do a good job. So I think that's good enough. I'm going to zoom back out so I can see it. There's no mask painted into the foreground, which is good. It looks like it's all covering the sky now. So I'm going to go ahead and click Align With, and this will allow me to select which image the program will align these images with. So automatically it's going to select the middle image from your image set, and the reason is because you have stars moving in and out of the frame along the edges. And what that means is that you can lose some detail along the edges if you don't select the middlemost image. So what I mean is if we look at the composite image, you can see here along the edges where these stars moving in and out probably aren't captured in every single frame. So what we want to do is we want to select the middle frame, which is what the software selects automatically. And we'll use that as the basis for our stacking. So once I've done that, I'll click Align in Composite, and it will take a moment to align the images, do the composite image, and remove the noise that it can remove from the final image. So we'll sit back while it does its thing. So the stacking is now completed, and here on this drop-down menu you can see that we have several choices to view for the final product. Min horizon noise and mean min horizon noise are going to be your two staple outputs. And you can see a slight difference between those two, but it's not big. The biggest difference I see is a slight difference in the brightness and a slight difference in the water reflection, how much is being reflected on the water. So I actually like the slightly darker version, and so we'll go ahead and select that one and we'll save it with the rest of our images. The other image that I'm going to save out of here is the min value. So you see the min value is darker, it doesn't have as many pinpoint stars, And what I'm going to use this image for is to darken the background night sky in the final image edit so that this Milky Way image, the Milky Way core, is brighter in the overall final image. So I'm also going to save the minimum value. And then I always take a look at the max value to see how many artifacts the stacking program is removing on its own. So here you can tell at the edges of the image what I was talking about with regards to the stars moving from left to right. These stars don't appear in every image, so they appear as streaks in the composite. These are planes and satellites that have traversed the sky during the duration of our shots. And so you can see that those are also being removed from the final image, which is good because we don't want those artifacts in our final shot. These duplex versions, the dupe means duplex, and what it's doing is it's taking 4 pixels and it's turning each of those 4 pixels into 1 pixel. So it has the tendency to concentrate very faint light, but it also reduces the quality of the image. So I would steer clear of the duplex versions that you're getting out of here. So with those files saved, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to quit Starry Landscape Stacker. So now we have all of the images that are necessary to go on and process these in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and open this image in Photoshop. And I'm also going to open the minimum value image as well. And what I'm going to do with that minimum value image is I'm going to select all by hitting Command A. I'm going to hit Command C to copy it. And I'm going to paste it into here. And you'll see it will paste into this document as a layer. So I'm going to go ahead and close that image because I have my layer produced now. Unlock the background layer, and I'm going to name my layers so that I don't get confused. So this will be my stacked layer, and this will be my minimum value layer. So now that I've got my layers loaded, the final piece that I'm going to bring into this file before I start is the tree detail image. So that was the last detail, or that was the last image that I shot, and it had extra detail of the trees. So I'm going to again Command A and Command C to select all and to copy that layer, and I'm going to name that layer so that I don't get confused. Alright. So I've got all my layers ready and loaded into one Photoshop document. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the tree detail layer off. I'm going to turn the min value layer off. I'm going to take this stacked background image layer and I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Command J. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some edits to this image by hitting Command Shift A. That will bring me the raw editor that's built into Photoshop. So I can use Adobe Camera Raw to apply file edits to this layer alone. So you can see by bringing up the color, or by the shadow details, that there actually is quite a bit of detail in these shadows. There's also quite a bit of noise left in this image if I crank those shadows details up too high. So I'm going to bring those up some. I'm also going to see what I can do in terms of bringing out some more of the detail in the sky. So I'm going to bring this exposure slider up some, again paying close attention to this histogram peak and keeping it around the 1/3, moving from left to right. And I'm going to again look at my Lagoon Nebula to see how I'm doing with regards to my overall brightness and highlight details. So I think I'm going to bring this down a little bit again, and I think I like the look of that to start with. There's a lot of orange in the horizon over here, and I'm going to fix some of that, but first I'm going to bring some more color out in this image overall because I think we have a little bit of headroom to go there before we're too blown out with the colors. So we'll do some of that and we'll call that good. And what I'm going to do again is I'm going to duplicate this layer again by hitting Command J, and this time I'm going to name this layer, and this is going to be my orange adjustments layer. So I'm going to go in again, Command-Shift-A is going to bring open my Adobe Raw editor. And I'm going to go into the HSL, the hue, saturation, luminance adjustments. I'm going to turn the oranges down. So look here, and you can see the saturation of the orange go from really oversaturated to pretty tolerable. So I'm also going to bring down the yellows to bring down that same area. And I'm going to bring down the luminance for the oranges and the yellows as well. Now, I'm also losing a lot of color in the Milky Way here, and the way that I'm going to correct for that is by applying a selective blend to this layer. So you can see it's really effective against that light pollution, but it's also destroying a lot of this detail through here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click to add a mask to this layer. I'm going to use the paint bucket tool to paint that mask completely black, and then I'm going to flip that to white, turn my brush on, and I'm going to use, you can see the hardness percentage as I move up and down here by holding Control and Option together. I can change the hardness, and I can also change the size by moving right to left. So I'm going to use a really soft but really large brush to brush in some detail. And you see I have my opacity and my flow both set to 20%. And so I'm actually going to up that to 50% so that I have a little bit stronger of a brush here and make this even larger. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to carefully brush out some of that orange and yellow detail that I really don't want in my shot. And once I've got a nice soft spot blown into my my image there, I'm going to stop. And that's all the edit that I'm going to add using this layer. But you can see how much of a difference that made in the light pollution, the appearance of the light pollution on the horizon there. So now I'm going to move on. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tree detail and I'm going to add some of that back in. So you see that's really stark looking image, and it's got a lot of noise in it. And you know, what I do like is that it provides a lot of detail for the trees. There's a lot of information there that's just simply missing from the other files. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take the tree, I'm going to select the tree detail, I'm going to use Command-Shift-A to open the Adobe Raw File Editor, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to kill some of this noise that's happening in this image. And by doing that, it will make it a little bit easier for me to blend this into the final picture. And I don't need a lot of detail in this in order for it to look really good because there's so much light on it compared to the rest of the image. So I'm going to go ahead and call that good. So with that, I'm going to reset my mask for the layer mask. I'm going to add a layer mask and I'm going to paint it black using the paint bucket tool, which will then allow me to go in and brush the image back in selectively using my tool brush here. So what I want to do is I want to have a flow that's around 20% and an opacity that's around 20% for this blending task, because I don't want too much to bleed over from the edges of this image, especially as I brush in the details right here along the very top. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to just gently blend this in, and once I get down to the tree itself and past the horizon, I can be a little bit more free, but I want to be really careful as I'm brushing in along the horizon line here. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger, and I'm going to go ahead and continue. And you can see some of that detail coming in from that image, and that's just what we want. So there were also some details in these surrounding trees that I would like to bring out as well. There wasn't too much over here, but again, as much detail as we can get into the foreground, we really want that because it helps balance the image. So you can see how nicely that really does work to bring some of that foreground detail back into the image. I think that looks pretty good, and you see we can kind of use it to make certain areas of the image look more natural again. But we also don't want to bring too much noise back into the image, so you want to balance how much detail you use from a single foreground shot, because it can kind of burn out your image. So it's kind of up to you, you just kind of have to balance it. And here I like the long reflection from the single exposure, so I'm going to bring that out in the final edit. And that allows me to more naturally blend these tree branches in as well. So I think that's about all I want to do, because I don't want it to get too bright in here really. So if I bring that back just a little bit, I think that looks pretty good. So overall, we have a nicely balanced image. Nothing is super bright as compared to anything else. We have some solid blacks, and we still have some nice crisp detail in the foreground. So I'm going to just go ahead, I'm going to go back through, and I'm going to blend out some of the areas that I don't want to have that extra noise in them. Okay. Bring the treetops back out. And so it is kind of a balancing act. So I think that looks about right. So then once I'm satisfied with the blending, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some edits to the sky itself. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these that I've made edits to, I'm going to take these images, I'm going to convert them to a smart object so that I have one solid piece of imagery. And what that will allow me to do is apply edits to the entire stack of layers without having to sacrifice the quality. So once this is done loading, which can take a minute, then I'm going to duplicate that by hitting Command J, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rasterize that layer so that it's flat again. So I still have this smart object, and I'm actually going to turn these layers off, but I still have this smart object so I can go backwards if I want to. But what I'm actually going to work on is a flat version of the same group of layers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the Photoshop actions that I purchased from photographingspace.com. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first apply the mini stars, and so what this is going to do is it's going to take a lot of these stars that are in the light field and it's going to make them physically smaller. What that does is it emphasizes some of the colors and some of the textures in the night sky that are not necessarily bright points of light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a medium version of that at Mini Stars 3, and I'm going to run that process on my flat rasterized layer. So I can toggle that on and off to see what that looks like. It might be hard for you to see on your monitor here, but it actually makes a nice little bit of difference in the image, and it makes you more able to see some of the finer details in the Milky Way, which I always like. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply Clara Sky. And you know, the thing that we're going to want to watch out for is that any degradation in the foreground as we run these actions on our images. So what I always check for is I just look at the foreground to see, and I don't see any difference with the mini stars, so that's okay. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So I'll run Clara Sky, I'll run a Clara Sky 3 on here, and you guys will see how much this really makes the details pop in the Milky Way. it brings out the darks in the Milky Way all over again, and it's just a really nice way to add some punchy contrast to your images. So I always like to use this. What I don't like is that it also has an effect on the foreground a lot of the times. So you can see here it does have an effect on the foreground, and it's making it a little bit maybe too contrasty, something that I wouldn't necessarily intend in a final image. Use a layer mask, and using a using a gradient tool brush, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to paint from white to black. I'm able to get the effect that I want in the sky while minimizing the negative effects on the foreground itself. So I like that. I think that looks okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. So what we'll do next is we'll flatten this image again by creating another smart object. Again, we always want to retain the ability to go backwards and make these edits backwards or undo the things that we've done to the image so that we have integrity in our editing process. And so I always make a copy and move forward from the copy before I'm completely finished with the image, so that if I need to change something, if I realized I missed a brush stroke or applied something too harshly, I can always go backwards. So now I've got my, my stack of images. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to again rasterize this layer. So I'm going to turn everything else off, and this is the last version that we're working with. So let's take a look at what it looks like. We still have a little bit of noise in the foreground, and I don't like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a dust and scratches filter. So I'm going to make a copy of this layer, and I'm going to call this layer the dust and scratches. And I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to treat it with a dust and scratches noise filter. And you see that just pulled away all the rest of the last straggling little bits of flaky, flecky noise in the foreground. And then I can adjust this so that it retains more detail if I think that's appropriate in an image. But I think right now where I want to be is somewhere on the low side here on this threshold, so I can really clean up some of the blacks here. So I think that looks really good. And again, we have a negative effect now in the sky. So what are we going to do? We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it in reverse. We're going to add a mask. We're going to use the gradient tool, and we are going to paint so that we apply just to the foreground. So you see my tool here shows me that I'm painting just in the foreground. That's about where I want it. That's good enough. And I can always go through and I can also refine this layer mask if I feel like, okay, I really want to get this part of the sky out of that layer. I can do that manually, but here it's not really needed because the horizon is pretty straight across. So I think that looks good. And I think that we're ready to call this image done with some very basic final edits. So what we want to do is I'm going to again combine these. I'm going to flatten them. First I'm going to duplicate it, then I'm going to rasterize it. And that will allow me to use my vignetting control, which I finally get to apply at the very end. So you see I have competing vignettes in the bottom and in the top, and that's okay. Because what I'm going to do in the top of this image is I'm actually going to blend in this minimum value again. So what this was the darks, right? So what we want to do here is we want to take a brush. So first we'll start with the layer mask, and we'll black out the layer mask. And then we'll just apply a brush to the very darkest areas, and we really want to go light here, and we really want to go just big soft brush so that we can brush in some darkness into this image. So what this will do is it will really enhance the sense that this was shot at night. And this matte, this is a nice layer to add because it's not just black, it's actually just the areas of darkness that were in the very minimum value processed stack. So it's trying to bring in some of the darks that you might lose when you process these images. So we get into something like that, and I'm looking like pretty good here. So I'm just gonna clean that up just a little bit. And there we go. I think we're about done. So the final step is then you just get to export it as JPEG, and you're ready to share, baby. You see, we're able to make a final image that has a lot of the quality and detail from the original ISO 10,000 images while being higher quality and really print ready. Just the details are really maintained. You can see in our Lagoon Nebula, you can see a lot of the shapes in that nebula. You can see the outline, it's not overblown in the center. That's why I always use it as a guide, because it really demonstrates for the rest of the image what the white balance should be. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. This is a technique that I use basically every time I make a landscape astrophotography image, and I think these results really speak for themselves. If you take a look at your monitor and you can see the difference, all the noise in the image on the left was the original, and then the very clean, beautiful image on the right is the stacked version. And yeah, I mean, it makes a difference across the entire image, and it really just allows you to even reveal details like this mountainside that simply are not present in the single exposure images. It's just, there's so much more detail that you can reveal from your shots by using this technique, and I hope that this video has been helpful and instructive. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be posting more tutorials in the future, and until then, keep on shooting.